The note on Judge Thompson's desk seems to carry the weight of untold stories. As he looks up at Officer Barrett, his expression shifts from stern authority to something more complex, understanding mixed with concern. "Tell me, Officer Barrett," he begins, his voice gentle but firm, "what brought you to our courthouse from Clayton County?" Barrett shifts uncomfortably in his chair, his earlier arrogance replaced by an uncertainty he clearly isn't used to showing. Outside the chamber windows, the morning bustle of the courthouse continues, but in here, time seems to stand still. The question hangs in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. "It wasn't my choice," Barrett finally admits, his voice barely above a whisper. The words seem to cost him something to say. His hands, resting on his knees, clench slightly. "There was an incident," he trails off, looking anywhere but at the judge. Judge Thompson nods slowly, tapping the note on his desk. "Yes, I'm reading about that incident right now. A confrontation with a black teenager outside a convenience store." He pauses, letting the words settle. "The report says you were convinced he was shoplifting. Turns out he was the owner's son, helping close up for the night." Barrett's face reddens, but there's something in his expression beyond simple embarrassment. A glimpse of pain, perhaps even shame. The judge notices this subtle shift, remembering something his grandmother used to say, "Hurt people hurt people." Meanwhile, in the lobby, word of what happened earlier has spread quickly. Miss Eleanor fields questions from concerned colleagues while trying to maintain order in the judge's absence. She thinks back to similar incidents over the years, remembering how Judge Thompson handled each one with a wisdom that often surprised everyone involved. Inside the chambers, Judge Thompson finally opens the worn leather folder. Inside are newspaper clippings, some yellow with age. The top one, dated 1989, shows a younger version of himself in a college sweatshirt, standing outside a different courthouse. The headline reads, "Local student files complaint against police officer, sparks community dialogue." 30 years ago, Judge Thompson begins, his voice taking on the tone he often uses when mentoring young lawyers. "I was pre-law at Emory. One night, leaving the library, an officer stopped me. He was convinced I'd stolen the books in my backpack." He pauses, watching Barrett's reaction carefully. What happened next changed both our lives. As he speaks, another knock at the door interrupts them. This time, it's Officer Rodriguez, Barrett's supervisor. She enters with a concerned look, carrying a file of her own. "Judge Thompson, I apologize for the interruption, but there's something you need to see regarding Officer Barrett's history." The tension in the room shifts again as Rodriguez places the file next to the judge's folder. Barrett's face strains of color. Clearly, whatever is in that file isn't something he wanted brought to light. But Judge Thompson's expression remains unchanged, his eyes still focused on the old newspaper clipping. "Before we open this," Judge Thompson says, gesturing to Rodriguez's file, "I want to share what happened after that night 30 years ago. The officer who stopped me, Officer Daniel Matthews, he's the reason I'm sitting in this chair today." Barrett looks up, confusion clear on his face. This isn't how he expected this conversation to go. Outside, the morning sun has fully risen, casting the chamber in warm light that seems at odds with the heavy atmosphere within. "You see?" Judge Thompson continues. "Officer Matthews could have let his pride, his prejudice, or his power guide his actions that night. Instead, he chose to listen, to learn. What he did next." The judge pauses, looking between Barrett and Rodriguez. "Well, that's surprisingly similar to what's in this new file about you, Officer Barrett." Rodriguez steps forward, her hand resting on the file she brought. "Judge, there's something else you should know. The teenager from the convenience store incident. His father reached out to us this morning. He's asking to meet with Officer Barrett, but not for the reasons we might think. Picture this, a crisp autumn morning in a small Virginia town. The sun hasn't fully risen, and the streets are quiet except for a black Mercedes sedan cruising down Main Street. Behind the wheel sits a man in civilian clothes, heading to an early morning meeting. A normal day about to take an extraordinary turn. The flashing lights appear in his rearview mirror. He signals and pulls over, following the routine countless drivers experience every day. But what happens next will expose deep-rooted issues in American law enforcement and challenge our understanding of prejudice, power, and privilege. The year is 2020, and this traffic stop is about to become national news. Not because of tragedy, thankfully, but because of who sits behind the wheel of that Mercedes. Lieutenant General Gary Brito, a three-star general in the United States Army with over 35 years of distinguished service to his country. Let me tell you what most news outlets got wrong about this story. They focused on the outrage, the viral social media posts, the predictable finger-pointing. But the real story, the one I'm about to share with you, goes much deeper. It's about a chance encounter that would expose uncomfortable truths about racial profiling and force an entire police department to confront its implicit biases. As General Brito handed over his license and registration that morning, Officer James Wilson saw only what he wanted to see: a black man in an expensive car in a town where, in his mind, that combination didn't quite fit. What he failed to notice was the military ID, the distinguished service pins on Brito's jacket, or the base access sticker clearly visible on the windshield. "Sir, where did you get this vehicle?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. General Brito, a man who had commanded thousands of troops and managed billion-dollar military operations, was being treated like a potential car thief. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn, one that would change both men's lives forever. The dashcam footage tells a story that words alone cannot capture. We see Brito's remarkable composure, his decades of military discipline evident in every measured response. "Officer," he says calmly, "I'd be happy to show you my military ID. I'm stationed at the base just up the road." But Officer Wilson, perhaps too caught up in his assumptions, continues down a path that would soon lead to a career-defining mistake. What happened next would spark conversations in living rooms, police stations, and military bases across America. But before we dive into those crucial moments, let me share something few people know about General Brito's background. This wasn't his first encounter with racial profiling. As a young lieutenant in the 1990s, he had experienced similar treatment. The difference? This time, he was in a position to turn this incident into a catalyst for change. The body camera footage shows Officer Wilson reaching for his handcuffs. "Step out of the vehicle, sir." The general complies, maintaining his dignity even as his rights are being violated. Other officers begin to arrive on scene. Among them is Sergeant Sarah Martinez, whose intervention will prove crucial to how this story unfolds. But here's where we need to pause and consider something important. This isn't just a story about a racist cop and a wronged military officer. It's more complex than that. It's about the systems that allow these incidents to happen, about the split-second decisions that can alter lives, and about what happens when unconscious bias meets unquestionable authority. As backup units surrounded the Mercedes that morning, none of them realized they were about to become part of a watershed moment in police-community relations. None of them knew that by the end of that day, their department would be forced to confront uncomfortable truths about its training, its culture, and its approach to community policing. General Brito stands there, hands clasped behind his back, as Officer Wilson begins to read him his rights. The general's phone buzzes in his pocket. It's the base commander wondering why he hasn't arrived for their scheduled meeting. Just yards away, a young soldier driving past recognizes his commanding officer and slams on his brakes, his jaw dropping at the scene unfolding before him. What happens in the next few minutes will shake the foundations of this small town's police department. It will lead to congressional hearings, policy changes, and a fundamental shift in how law enforcement approaches traffic stops. But more importantly, it will bring two men from vastly different worlds face to face with their own preconceptions and biases. As the handcuffs click around General Brito's wrists, no one present realizes that this moment will soon be seen by millions, sparking debates about race, authority, and justice in America. No one knows that this routine traffic stop is about to become a turning point in the ongoing conversation about police reform and racial equality. But before we reveal what happened next, we need to understand the forces that brought these two men together on that fateful morning. We need to explore the background of both Officer Wilson and General Brito, because their stories, individually and together, tell us something profound about America in the 21st century. What transforms this from a simple case of mistaken identity into a moment of national reckoning? What happens when Sergeant Martinez finally reads General Brito's military ID? And how does this incident become a catalyst for change in police departments across the country? The answers to these questions will challenge everything you think you know about power, privilege, and justice in America. But first, let's take a step back and look at the events that set this extraordinary chain of events in motion. Let's rewind to 18 months before that fateful traffic stop. Officer James Wilson sits in a department training session, absently tapping his pen against his notepad. The topic: implicit bias in policing. Like many of his colleagues, he believes these sessions are just bureaucratic box-checking exercises. After 12 years on the force, he's confident in his instincts. Those instincts, he'll later admit, were shaped by thousands of traffic stops, hundreds of arrests, and a worldview formed in a predominantly white suburb. Meanwhile, across town at Fort Belvoir, Lieutenant General Gary Brito is reviewing troop readiness reports in his office. Photos on his wall tell the story of a remarkable career: a young lieutenant in Desert Storm, a battalion commander in Iraq, a strategic planner at the Pentagon. But there's another photo, tucked away in his desk drawer, a reminder of why this upcoming traffic stop will resonate so deeply with him. The hidden photo shows a teenage Brito with his father, standing beside their family car in 1982. It was the night the police officer had held them at gunpoint, mistaking them for robbery suspects. That incident helped shape young Gary's understanding of both justice and injustice, fueling his dedication to leadership and systemic change within the military. The morning of the traffic stop began like any other. Officer Wilson had started his shift at 6 a.m., responding to a vague alert about a stolen luxury vehicle in the area. The description was frustratingly broad: a black Mercedes sedan. No license plate number, no specific model year, just a general warning to be on the lookout. General Brito had woken up early too, preparing for a crucial meeting about upcoming troop deployments. He chose civilian clothes that day instead of his uniform, a decision that would prove significant. His Mercedes, a car he'd owned for 3 years, was recently detailed and gleaming in the morning sun. But there's something else you need to know about that morning. Sergeant Sarah Martinez wasn't supposed to be working at all. She'd swapped shifts with another officer to attend her daughter's school play that afternoon. Her presence at the scene would prove to be more than just coincidence. It would become a crucial element in how events unfolded. As we piece together the events of that morning, we need to understand the climate in which this incident occurred. The town had seen a spike in auto thefts, creating pressure on officers to be more proactive in their traffic stops. The department's leadership had implemented new policies around vehicle theft prevention, but these policies, as we'd soon learn, left considerable room for officer discretion. Officer Wilson had made 3 traffic stops already that morning, all routine, all ending with nothing more than warnings. But something about the Mercedes caught his attention. Later, in his official statement, he would struggle to articulate exactly what that something was. This hesitation, this inability to clearly explain his actions, would become a crucial point in the investigations that followed. What we know from the dashcam footage is that General Brito's Mercedes was traveling exactly at the speed limit. His turn signals were used appropriately. His windows weren't tinted beyond legal limits. In fact, there was nothing about his driving that warranted attention. The stop, as would later be determined, was based entirely on what Officer Wilson called the gut feeling. But here's where the story takes another unexpected turn. Just moments before Wilson activated his lights, another officer had radioed in about recovering the stolen Mercedes they'd been warned about on the other side of town. This information, critical as it was, hadn't yet reached Wilson. The dispatcher who received the update was handling multiple calls, creating a delay that would have significant consequences. As General Brito sat handcuffed in the back of the patrol car, a remarkable scene was unfolding at the base. The young soldier who had witnessed the stop rushed to inform his superiors. Word spread quickly through the chain of command, reaching the base commander just as he was about to call General Brito about his missed meeting. What happened next involves a series of phone calls that would send shockwaves through both the military and law enforcement communities. But before we get to those calls, we need to understand something crucial about Sergeant Martinez's role in all of this. As the highest-ranking officer on scene after responding to the backup call, she had both the authority and the responsibility to take control of the situation. Martinez had recently completed an advanced training course in community policing, one that emphasized the importance of slowing down high-stress situations and gathering all available information before escalating. As she approached the scene, she noticed something none of the other officers had: the Department of Defense sticker on the Mercedes windshield. But even as Martinez began to piece things together, the situation continued to escalate. More patrol cars arrived, drawn by the unusual amount of radio traffic. Local residents began to gather, phones recording. Among them was Lisa Chen, a local journalist who would later play a crucial role in how this story was told to the world. The tension at the scene was building. General Brito remained remarkably calm, even as he watched his military ID being passed from officer to officer. His thoughts, as he would later reveal in an exclusive interview, weren't about himself but about the younger soldiers of color under his command who might face similar situations with far less protection than his rank afforded. As the morning sun climbed higher in the sky, none of the officers present realized they were standing at a crossroads of American culture, where issues of race, authority, and justice were about to collide in a way that would force everyone involved to confront their own beliefs and biases. What exactly did Sergeant Martinez discover when she finally read General Brito's military ID? How did Officer Wilson react when he realized the magnitude of his mistake? And what role did that young soldier's quick thinking play in what happened next? The next 15 minutes would change lives forever. As Sergeant Martinez held General Brito's military ID in her hands, her training kicked in. She'd seen enough military IDs during her 4 years stationed at the Norfolk Naval Base to know this one was authentic. But it wasn't just authentic, it was high-ranking. Very high-ranking. "Sir," she called out to Officer Wilson, her voice steady but urgent. "We need to talk." The body camera footage shows Wilson's face as Martinez explains who they've actually detained. His expression shifts from confusion to disbelief, and finally to something much more complex, the look of someone watching their entire career crumble before their eyes. But here's something the news reports missed entirely. General Brito wasn't the first high-ranking military officer to be pulled over in this town under suspicious circumstances. 6 months earlier, a black Navy captain had filed a complaint about aggressive questioning during a routine traffic stop. That complaint had been quietly handled with a verbal warning to the officer involved. Now, as Sergeant Martinez would later testify, she couldn't help but see the pattern. Meanwhile, the young soldier who'd witnessed the stop had reached the base commander's office. Colonel Richard Hayes, a 30-year veteran himself, listened to the breathless report with growing concern. His first call wasn't to the police department or the media. It was to his own superior officers. Within minutes, the incident had caught the attention of the Pentagon. Back at the scene, something remarkable was happening. The growing crowd of onlookers included Mary Thompson, a retired civil rights attorney who lived nearby. She'd started live streaming the incident, providing commentary that would later prove crucial in understanding how the situation unfolded. Her video captured something the police body cameras missed: the reactions of other officers arriving on scene as word spread about who they had in custody. But let's talk about Lisa Chen, the local journalist who happened to be there. She'd been working on a series about community policing, interviewing officers and residents about their experiences. Now, watching this scene unfold, she realized she was witnessing the perfect case study of everything her investigation had uncovered: the good, the bad, and the complicated. Officer Wilson, still processing the magnitude of his mistake, had to make a decision. Protocol dictated certain steps when an officer realizes they've made a wrongful arrest. But nothing in his training had prepared him for this particular situation. As he reached for his keys to remove the handcuffs, his hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the adrenaline crash of realizing how badly he'd misjudged the situation. General Brito, still calm and composed, watched these developments with the analytical eye of someone who'd spent decades studying leadership and crisis management. His military training had taught him about transforming challenging moments into opportunities for change. But even he couldn't have predicted how this incident would ripple through both the military and law enforcement communities. Here's where the story takes another unexpected turn. Among the gathering crowd was Officer Wilson's former field training officer, now retired. Robert Martinez, no relation to Sergeant Martinez, had trained dozens of officers over his 20-year career. Watching his former trainee's mistake unfold publicly stirred something in him. The statement he would later give to Internal Affairs would shed light on systemic issues in police training that had been overlooked for years. As Sergeant Martinez began the process of releasing General Brito, dispatch finally radioed in the update about the actual stolen vehicle, the one that had been recovered across town. The timing would have been almost comical if the situation weren't so serious. The dashcam picked up Officer Wilson's quiet response. Oh my God. But there's more to this story than just a case of mistaken identity or racial profiling. In the crowd that morning was Trevor Williams, a local high school student who'd been stopped by Officer Wilson just 2 weeks earlier. Trevor filmed the entire incident on his phone, and his perspective would later become crucial in understanding the broader pattern of behavior that led to this moment. The base commander, Colonel Hayes, arrived on scene just as General Brito was being released from the handcuffs. What happened next was captured on multiple cameras, body cams, cell phones, and news cameras that have begun to arrive. But each angle tells a slightly different story. The conversation between these two senior military officers and the police leadership would later be described as a masterclass in professional confrontation. As word spread through military channels, another layer of complexity emerged. General Brito's position made him responsible for diversity and inclusion initiatives within his command. The irony of his situation wasn't lost on anyone, but how he chose to handle the next few moments would set the tone for everything that followed. Lisa Chen, still filming, noticed something others missed. In the middle of this tense scene, General Brito took a moment to speak quietly with Trevor Williams, the student who'd had his own encounter with Officer Wilson. What was said in that brief conversation? And how did it influence the events that followed? The department's Internal Affairs Division was already mobilizing, but they faced an unprecedented situation. How do you investigate an incident that's rapidly becoming a national story? More importantly, how do you handle a case where the victim outranks nearly everyone in the military chain of command? As reporters began arriving on scene, drawn by the viral social media posts and frantic calls from witnesses, a new question emerged. How would this incident impact the already delicate relationship between the military base and the local community? And what about Officer Wilson? What consequences would he face for a mistake that was rapidly becoming a national symbol of systemic problems in law enforcement? But the biggest question remained unanswered. What would General Brito do next? His response would not only determine the fate of Officer Wilson, but potentially reshape police-military relations across the country. As the morning's events continued to unfold, no one present could have predicted the extraordinary chain of events that was about to begin. The next hour would prove crucial in how this story would be remembered. As General Brito stood free of handcuffs, straightening his jacket with the same precision he'd learned at West Point decades ago, he faced a choice that would impact not just his own legacy, but the lives of countless others in uniform and behind badges. The police chief had just arrived on scene, his usual confident stride noticeably hesitant. Chief Michael Roberts had built his career on community policing and transparency, but nothing in his 27 years of service had prepared him for this moment. The dashcam footage shows him approaching General Brito, hand extended, a gesture that would be analyzed and debated for months to come. But before that conversation could begin, something unexpected happened. Officer Wilson stepped forward. The body cameras captured what happened next from 3 different angles, each telling a slightly different part of the story. Wilson's face showed the internal struggle of a man fighting against years of ingrained defensive instincts. His next words would surprise everyone present. Meanwhile, Trevor Williams, the high school student who'd had his own encounter with Wilson, had been quietly texting his father, Reverend James Williams of the First Baptist Church. The Reverend's arrival would add another layer to an already complex situation. As a member of the Police Oversight Committee and a respected community leader, his presence would force everyone to confront the broader implications of what was unfolding. Lisa Chen's keen journalist's eye noticed something others missed. Sergeant Martinez had positioned herself strategically between Officer Wilson and the growing crowd. It wasn't just crowd control. She was protecting Wilson, even as she struggled with her own feelings about what had transpired. Her body camera would later reveal her whispering something to Wilson, words that would become crucial in understanding everything that followed. The base commander, Colonel Hayes, was on the phone with the Pentagon, his free hand gesturing as he tried to explain the situation. But the story was already spreading faster than anyone could control it. Mary Thompson's livestream had gone viral, with comments pouring in from across the country. The incident was quickly becoming a lightning rod for discussions about race, authority, and accountability in America. But here's what the viral videos didn't show. In the middle of this chaos, General Brito had pulled out his own phone. The call he made wasn't to his superiors or to the media. Instead, he dialed a number that would prove significant in the hours to come. The person on the other end of that call would play a pivotal role in what happened next. Officer Wilson's former training officer, Robert Martinez, had moved closer to the scene. His presence added another layer of tension. He trained half the officers present, including Wilson. The look on his face suggested he was seeing the results of something he'd long feared. Later, his testimony would reveal concerns he'd raised years ago about training procedures that had been dismissed. As news helicopters began circling overhead, another player entered the scene. Sarah Rodriguez, the police department's newly appointed diversity and inclusion coordinator, arrived slightly out of breath. She'd been hired just 3 months ago, following a series of controversial incidents. Her role in what was about to unfold would prove either vindication or failure for the department's reform efforts. The crowd had grown larger, but something unusual was happening. Instead of the angry shouts that often accompany such incidents, there was an expectant hush. People seemed to sense they were witnessing something historic. Phones recorded from every angle as General Brito and Chief Roberts stood face to face, two men with decades of public service between them, about to have a conversation that would echo far beyond this small town. But before either man could speak, Reverend Williams stepped forward. His presence changed the dynamic instantly. He'd been working behind the scenes for years, trying to bridge the gap between law enforcement and the community. Now, standing between the police chief and the three-star general, he saw an opportunity that transcended the immediate crisis. The tension in the air was palpable. Officer Wilson stood slightly apart, his body camera still running, recording what would become one of the most studied pieces of police footage in recent history. His next decision would either escalate or defuse a situation that was balanced on a knife's edge. Trevor Williams had moved closer to General Brito, phone still recording. The young man's own experience with law enforcement had left him cynical. Something about this moment felt different. The conversation he'd had earlier with the general had given him a perspective he hadn't expected. Sergeant Martinez's radio crackled with updates from dispatch. Internal Affairs was en route. The mayor had been notified. The FBI's Civil Rights Division had already reached out. But all of that seemed secondary to what was about to happen right here, right now. The base commander ended his call with the Pentagon, his expression grave. Whatever instructions he received would influence the next few crucial moments. He moved to stand beside General Brito, a subtle but clear show of military solidarity that didn't go unnoticed by anyone present. As Chief Roberts finally began to speak, Lisa Chen's camera focused on General Brito's face. His expression would later be described as unreadable, but those who knew him best would recognize the look. It was the same expression he wore before making decisions that would change lives. The next few moments would determine whether this incident would become another tragic example of systemic failure or something entirely different. A turning point in how law enforcement and the military handle race, power, and accountability. As tension reached its peak, no one present could have predicted what was about to happen next. The silence broke with Officer Wilson's voice, steady despite the tension. "General Brito, sir," he began, removing his badge with trembling hands, "I need to apologize." What happened next would rewrite the expected script of police-community confrontations. Instead of offering a formal, rehearsed apology, Wilson did something unprecedented. He started talking about his grandfather. "My grandfather was a Buffalo soldier in World War II," Wilson revealed, his voice carrying across the now hushed crowd. "He faced discrimination while wearing his country's uniform, and today, I did exactly what those officers did to him." The raw honesty of his words caught everyone off guard, especially General Brito, whose expression shifted subtly as he recognized something familiar in Wilson's story. But it was Sergeant Martinez who provided the next surprise. She stepped forward with her body camera footage already queued up on her phone. "Sir," she addressed both the General and Chief Roberts, "there's something you need to see." The footage showed Wilson's initial approach to the Mercedes, but more importantly, it captured a crucial radio transmission that had been missed in the chaos, one that would reshape everyone's understanding of what had really happened that morning. The transmission revealed that Officer Wilson had actually been responding to a different call entirely when he spotted the general's car. The stolen vehicle alert had been a coincidence, a detail that would prove crucial in the investigations that followed. This revelation shifted the narrative from a simple racial profiling case to something more complex, a story about how split-second decisions and unconscious biases can collide with devastating consequences. General Brito's response would later be described by CNN as a masterclass in leadership. Instead of accepting Wilson's badge, he did something unexpected. He pulled out his phone and showed everyone the picture from his desk drawer, the one of him and his father after their own police encounter decades ago. "Officer Wilson," he said, "surrendering your badge is easy. Changing the system is hard. I have a different proposition for you." The proposition he outlined there, on that street corner, would eventually become a national model for police reform. But first, Chief Roberts had his own revelation to share. The diversity training program that Wilson had dismissed, it had been inspired by a similar incident involving the chief's own son, a story he'd never shared publicly until that moment. Trevor Williams, still recording on his phone, captured what happened next. General Brito turned to the growing crowd and began to speak, not as a three-star general, but as a father who'd had to teach his own children about dealing with law enforcement. His words would later go viral, but not for the reasons anyone expected. "This moment," he declared, "isn't about punishment, it's about progress." He then revealed the identity of the person he'd called earlier, Dr. Angela Harris, a renowned expert in police community relations who had already been working secretly with the department on a revolutionary training program. Wilson, it turned out, had unknowingly been selected to be part of its first pilot group. But the biggest surprise came from Reverend Williams. The Oversight Committee had been preparing to release a report on the department's traffic stop practices. The data revealed something stunning. Officer Wilson, despite this incident, had one of the lowest racial disparity rates in the department. The discovery would force everyone to confront uncomfortable questions about systemic issues versus individual actions. As Chief Roberts prepared to address the media gathering at the edge of the scene, Colonel Hayes received another call from the Pentagon. The message he received would transform this local incident into a national initiative. The military, it seemed, had been looking for exactly this kind of opportunity to launch a new joint training program between base personnel and local law enforcement. The crowd watched in amazement as General Brito extended his hand to Officer Wilson. What he said next left everyone stunned. "Next week," he announced, "Officer Wilson will be teaching a session at the base about this incident. Not because he got it wrong, but because he was willing to admit it and learn from it." Lisa Chen's camera caught the moment perfectly. The handshake between a three-star general and a patrol officer, both men fighting back tears. But it was Sergeant Martinez who delivered the final twist. She revealed that her body camera had captured something else that morning, a conversation between two other officers that would spark a separate investigation, one that would lead all the way to the state capitol. As the crowd began to disperse, Trevor Williams approached Officer Wilson. The conversation that followed wasn't recorded by any camera, but its impact would be felt in the months to come, as both men became unexpected partners in a community outreach program that would change hundreds of lives. The final surprise came 3 months later, when the department's new training program was unveiled. Leading the first session were three unlikely partners: General Brito, Officer Wilson, and Trevor Williams. Their story had become more than just another viral video about police misconduct. It had become a blueprint for turning potential tragedy into transformation. But perhaps the most powerful moment came during that first training session, when Officer Wilson shared the full story about his grandfather. The revelation he made that day would force everyone in the room to reconsider everything they thought they knew about this incident. And it all started with a traffic stop that went wrong in all the right ways. The revelation about Officer Wilson's grandfather struck the room into silence during that first training session. The elderly veteran had not only served as a Buffalo soldier, he had later become one of the first black police officers in Birmingham, Alabama. Wilson had never shared this story before, not even with his fellow officers. His grandfather had quit the force after just 2 years, driven out by the very systemic racism he'd fought against in the military. "I became a cop to finish what he started," Wilson admitted, his voice cracking. "But somewhere along the way, I became part of the problem I was supposed to fix." The body camera footage playing behind him showed his confrontation with General Brito, now being used as a teaching moment in police academies across the country. But the real breakthrough came when Trevor Williams stepped forward to share his story. His previous encounter with Officer Wilson hadn't gone viral, hadn't made headlines. It was just one of countless routine traffic stops that happen every day across America. But now, standing before a room full of officers and military personnel, Trevor revealed something that changed the entire narrative. During that earlier stop, Officer Wilson had actually helped him. When Trevor's car broke down after the stop, Wilson didn't just drive away. He waited with the teenager until a tow truck arrived, even paying for the service himself. This act of kindness had been overshadowed by the tension and fear Trevor felt during the initial interaction, a contradiction that perfectly illustrated the complex relationship between law enforcement and the communities they serve. General Brito seized upon this moment to unveil the program's most innovative feature. Every officer would now spend 1 day per month living the experiences of the communities they served. Not just riding along or walking the beat, but actually living with families, sharing meals, attending community events. The program, dubbed Walk a Mile, would later be adopted by departments nationwide. But it was Sergeant Martinez who delivered the most unexpected development. The conversation her body camera had captured between two other officers revealed a broader conspiracy within the department. Several officers had been deliberately targeting military personnel of color, believing they were less likely to file complaints. This discovery led to a federal investigation that would ultimately expose similar patterns in departments across 5 states. The ripple effects continued to spread. Lisa Chen's coverage of the incident won her a Pulitzer Prize, not for exposing police misconduct, but for documenting how one community transformed a potential crisis into an opportunity for genuine change. Her series of articles showed how the incident had sparked a national conversation about the intersection of military service, law enforcement, and race in America. Chief Roberts took the boldest step of all. He instituted a new policy requiring all senior officers to publicly share their own stories of mistakes and learning moments. His personal story about his son's encounter with law enforcement became the cornerstone of a new approach to police leadership, one based on vulnerability and genuine accountability rather than infallibility. The final twist came 6 months after the initial incident. Officer Wilson was promoted to sergeant, but not in the police department. He accepted a position as a training coordinator at Fort Belvoir, working directly under General Brito's command. Their unlikely partnership became a symbol of what could happen when people chose transformation over punishment, understanding over anger. Trevor Williams graduated high school that spring. At the ceremony, both Officer Wilson and General Brito were in attendance. The scholarship he received, funded jointly by the police department and the military base, would send him to college to study criminal justice reform. His senior thesis would later become the foundation for a groundbreaking new approach to community policing. The stolen car that started it all. It turned out to be a clerical error. The vehicle reported stolen was actually a different Mercedes, owned by another high-ranking military officer. This coincidence led to the discovery of serious flaws in the department's dispatch system, ultimately resulting in a complete overhaul of how information was shared between law enforcement agencies. But perhaps the most powerful moment came 1 year later, when Officer Wilson's grandfather, now 94 years old, returned to Birmingham to be honored by the police department he'd left decades ago. Standing beside him were his grandson, General Brito, and Trevor Williams. 3 generations of change, linked by a traffic stop that went wrong in all the right ways. The program they created together continues to evolve, challenging both law enforcement and military personnel to confront their biases and transform their relationships with the communities they serve. And it all began with a simple traffic stop on a quiet Virginia morning, proving that sometimes the most powerful changes come from our most uncomfortable moments. As General Brito often says in his keynote speeches about that day, sometimes it takes a mistake to build a miracle. The miracle, in this case, wasn't just about one traffic stop or one officer's transformation. It was about an entire community choosing to see beyond the initial conflict to create something revolutionary, a new model of justice that begins with understanding and ends with real, lasting change. Today, 3 years after that fateful traffic stop, the impact continues to ripple through communities across America. The Walk a Mile program has been implemented in over 200 police departments nationwide, with remarkable results. Police complaints have dropped by 45% in participating jurisdictions, while community engagement has reached unprecedented levels. But the real story isn't in the statistics, it's in the lives changed. Every Tuesday morning, you'll find Officer James Wilson, now Sergeant Wilson, teaching at the Fort Belvoir Training Center. His classes always begin the same way, with that dashcam footage of his encounter with General Brito. I show this, he tells his students, not to shame myself, but to show that growth is always possible, no matter how difficult the starting point. Trevor Williams graduated summa cum laude last spring, his thesis on community policing reform already being implemented as a pilot program in 3 states. The scholarship program he inspired has now sent 15 other students to college, all pursuing careers in law enforcement or criminal justice reform. What happened that day showed me that change isn't just possible. Trevor often says at community meetings, it's inevitable when people choose to learn from their mistakes. Sergeant Sarah Martinez received a promotion too, but not in the way anyone expected. She now heads the department's newly created Community Relations Division, working alongside Dr. Angela Harris to expand the training program that emerged from that morning's events. Their partnership has become a model for departments nationwide, proving that meaningful change requires both internal leadership and external expertise. The conversation Martinez's body camera captured that day led to more than just administrative changes. The federal investigation it sparked has resulted in comprehensive reforms in police departments across 5 states. More importantly, it opened up honest discussions about the unique challenges faced by military personnel of color in their interactions with law enforcement. Lisa Chen's Pulitzer-winning coverage didn't end with the initial incident. She spent 2 years documenting the transformation of the department and the community. Her latest book, The Stop: How One Mistake Changed American Policing, is now required reading in police academies across the country. The story never ended, she writes in the introduction. It just kept growing, touching more lives, inspiring more change. Chief Roberts retired last year, but not before implementing his most significant reform, the Transparency and Leadership Initiative. Every officer in a command position now maintains a public record of their mistakes and learning moments. We're not perfect, the policy states, but we're perfectly committed to growth. The program has been so successful that military bases have begun adopting similar practices. Remember Mary Thompson, the retired civil rights attorney who live-streamed the incident? She now chairs the expanded Police Oversight Committee, working alongside both law enforcement and community members to ensure reforms stay on track. Her viral video has become a teaching tool, shown in law schools nationwide as an example of how crisis can lead to transformation. General Brito retired from active duty last month, but his work continues. The training center at Fort Belvoir has been renamed the Brito Center for Leadership and Community Relations. Military personnel and law enforcement officers from across the country come to learn the principles that emerged from that morning's encounter. Leadership, Brito often tells them, isn't about avoiding mistakes, it's about having the courage to learn from them. Officer Wilson's grandfather, now 97, still visits the training center occasionally. His presence serves as a living reminder of how far we've come and how far we still have to go. Last month, he watched his grandson receive the department's new Community Bridge Builder Award, created to recognize officers who go above and beyond in building trust between law enforcement and the communities they serve. The stolen car alert that started it all? It led to a complete overhaul of the dispatch system, now adopted by departments nationwide. The new system includes built-in cross-checks and verification protocols, significantly reducing the likelihood of mistaken identifications. Sometimes, as General Brito likes to say, the biggest problems can lead to the most important solutions. As for that Mercedes, General Brito still drives it. He kept it as a reminder, he says, that even our most challenging moments can become our most transformative opportunities. The Department of Defense sticker is still there on the windshield, alongside a new one, a small badge that reads Bridge Builder. Today, if you visit that street corner where everything happened, you'll find a small plaque commemorating the incident. It doesn't mention mistakes or accusations. Instead, it simply reads, "On this spot, a community chose understanding over anger, growth over blame, and found a new way forward together." The story of that traffic stop continues to evolve, touching new lives and inspiring new changes. But perhaps its greatest legacy isn't in the programs or policies it created, but in the simple truth it revealed. That real change happens not when we're at our best, but when we're brave enough to learn from our worst. As Trevor Williams said in his graduation speech, looking out at an audience that included both Officer Wilson and General Brito. Sometimes the wrong turn leads you exactly where you need to go. And that's what this story ultimately teaches us, that in our most challenging moments lies the potential for our greatest transformation. That's our story, but it's not really the end. Because somewhere right now, in cities and towns across America, the lessons learned from that morning continue to shape new encounters, guide new decisions, and build new bridges between communities. And maybe that's the real miracle. Not that it happened, but that it keeps happening, one interaction at a time, one lesson at a time, one change at a time.